Yeah, if this was a 105-year bond, that bond would have matured right now, and it would have paid you $191,000, roughly speaking. No, I'm sorry, $18,000 face value. But in terms of purchasing power, that only still buys 1,000 heads of caps. That's it. But these protect you from inflation. And U.S. Treasury started these bonds in 1970s for a good reason. The first bout of real high inflation in U.S. was in 1970s, among other reasons because of the oil crises. There were two oil crises in 1970s, one in 1973 after the Six Days War, which is also known as the Yom Kippur War in Israel. Uh, U.S. pretty much had to bail Israel out, otherwise, because this was a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria, and all the Arab countries, oil-producing Arab countries, put an embargo on oil on U.S. They said we're not selling any oil to U.S. There were other ways to get around it. If a German company bought it, they could sell it to U.S., but that increased the prices. I think a barrel of oil those days were trading around $3 a barrel. It went up to $10 pretty much overnight. There was another one in 1978, 79, after the Iranian Revolution, and U.S. experienced, for also other reasons too, structural reasons, high inflations. In fact, inflations in the second half of 1970s was up close to 10% sustainably. Then after 1982, Fed actually did a drastic rate increases. It came down. So Treasury said, you know, if we try to borrow nominal, people don't buy it because they're afraid of inflation. So they came up with tips and they started doing that. If I'm a pension fund, a lot of times the promises of pension funds, especially healthcare expenses or pensions, are typically indexed to inflation. If inflation is high, a pension fund is supposed to pay high benefits. If I'm a pension fund, I'm going to grab this because I'm protected from inflation. It's like a natural hedge. My expenses are directly correlated with inflation. If my returns are correlated with inflation, I'm home. Let's look at the current numbers. Let's look at 5 years, nominal, and there are a lot of places you can look these up, but I typically look them up from CNBC because it's easy to do so. All right. For example, if I type US 5 years, 5Y, it tells me 2-1. The first one is the standard US Treasury. It yields 3.579. The second one is 5-year tips. It yields 1.469. But the second yield is real. Okay. 577. Man, I'm getting old. Normally, I remember three numbers, and I don't forget them for a while, but now too barely. Years ago, when COVID was at its highest, I was getting my COVID numbers from a chart, and I could have four numbers to my head, go to my Excel, write them, come back. Now I can barely do two. So implied inflation using the, I'm going to call this pi star. 1 plus nominal, 1 plus real minus 1. So that would be 1. Oops. Actually, let me do it here. 1 plus 3.577% divided by 1 plus 1.467% minus 1, or 2.08%. Here's what that means. This is the market's implied rate of inflation. That does not mean that inflation is going to be 2.8%. Here's what that means. Suppose Rachel thinks that for a lot of different reasons, US inflation is going to be 3% on average over the next 5 years. Would you buy the nominal bonds and guarantee to get 3.577%, or the real bonds and get 1.467 real return? Which one would you prefer? You expect that inflation is going to be 3% over the next 5 years. Which one is more attractive to you? The real one. Because think of it this way. If inflation, I'm going to do this approximately for the sake of mental calculation. Let's call that 147. If inflation is 3%, you're going to get approximately 4.47 in nominal returns. But with the nominal one, you're going to get only 3.57. So anytime your expected inflation, your personal expectations that are above the implied inflation, you want to choose the real. Anytime you believe that it's going to be less, you choose the nominal, right? But that's kind of also an indicative of what you think Fed is going to do. Fed's target rate of inflation is about 2%. Okay. If the market's average expected inflation is about 2%, market's saying, rates are going to come down quite a bit, right? Let's look. The same number about a year ago was over 2.5. So market necessarily didn't believe that inflation was going to come down that fast. Let's look at the 30 years. Let's do 10 year. 30 years is too speculative in terms of inflation expectations. Nominal 3.808. And real is 1.598%. And implied inflation. One plus 'So over the next year, market's expecting inflation to average about 218, which means, in the first 5 years, they expect 208. That means in the second 5 years, they expect something much larger. Probably that number is about 236, 240 or so. In fact, there is a series Federal Reserve calculates. It's called 5-year forwards, 5-year inflation rate. They calculate that using approximations, but we can kind of see what market was imputing in a sense. If you go to, if you search for Fred St. Louis, Fred is short for Federal Reserve Economic Database, and it's maintained by St. Louis Fed, depending upon your accent, St. Louis. Let's do a search. A lot of economic data. This is a very good source, actually. 5-year forward. I'm going to do just 1 year for now. Currently, that number is at 231. Okay. And let's just look at about a year ago. That number stood around 246. Well, about a month ago, 219. Now let's do 5 years. About 2.5 years ago, 250. But back in COVID days, 143. These kinds of stuff guides traders, guides policymakers, because these are rates implied by the market rates. So if Fed thinks that market is imputing a 2.5% inflation rate, they say it is not time to decrease the interest rates yet. Because market does not believe that inflation is going to be that low if we keep the current policy or current expectations of the policy. All right. Okay, I get good time.